Welcome to the From Harm to Healing podcast. I'm your host, Chris Jones, and I'm a therapist who runs the From Harm to Healing treatment program, an online program for men who have engaged in infidelity or compulsive sexual behaviours within the context of an intimate relationship. I started this podcast to illuminate some of the common blind spots within the treatment fields for compulsive sexual behaviour or sex addiction through the lens of the deceptive sexuality trauma model. I hope you find this resource enlightening, particularly if you're somebody navigating the pain of betrayal and deception for yourself. Thank you for listening to the From Harm to Healing podcast. In a previous episode, we looked at the trauma responses that come from the acute trauma of discovery or disclosure of a secret sexual basement in the relationship. And remember, it's critically important that we have some understanding of those trauma reactions we're likely to see in that kind of situation, and to understand that those reactions we see are actually normal and to be expected if we're looking at the impact through the lens of trauma. For somebody that's experienced an acute trauma, it's normal that their nervous system is now in a state of hypervigilance. It's in survival mode, scanning for any potential threat. So if we take that as our baseline, a fundamental principle for us to understand is that the person ultimately doesn't feel safe. That's not just a thought process or a belief that they're not safe. That's actually on a physiological or nervous system level. So if we take that principle further, it naturally follows that the person who feels unsafe in that way will engage in safety-seeking behaviours in order to try and alleviate that feeling, that lack of safety. So if I don't feel safe, I naturally want to seek safety. And we talked a little bit last time about constriction as a trauma response, and that in itself is a form of safety seeking. If I perhaps avoid going to certain places or seeing certain people, or avoid putting myself in certain situations, that may provide some temporary safety by reducing the potential for threats. So that would be a self-focused form of safety seeking, something that I can do, that I'm in control of. But a lot of the safety seeking will also naturally relate to the person that built the basement and what I need from them now in order for me to feel safe. So that's a type of safety seeking I want to focus on here, because we need to understand what's going on if we want to avoid pathologizing the partner's reactions and potentially causing additional harm. After the discovery has occurred, the partner is desperately trying to make sense of exactly what happened in the basement, desperately trying to piece together her reality. And so that can take the form of things like repeated, intense, sometimes angry questioning about what he did in the basement, what the behaviours were, how often did he do those things, who did he do those things with. And remember, for the betrayed partner, this is much more than just being hurt by something. This is the sense of her actual reality being shattered, being destroyed, her psychological safety nets, her view of who her partner is or was has crumbled. And so it makes sense that she now desperately needs to piece that back together and to know the truth, to know the story of what actually occurred. It might also include things like her setting significant boundaries that she needs him to follow, like perhaps asking him to avoid certain places where she might perceive that there are potential sexual triggers for him, things that are reminders of what happened in the basement. It might be wanting to track where he is, where he's going, what he's doing, maybe through mobile phone apps. It might be boundaries around watching things on TV that might have sexual or romantic content in them. And I really want to state here again that this is understandable when we look at it through the lens that I've been trying to illuminate on this podcast. So if we understand it as an acute traumatic impact that has occurred, that the person's reality has fractured, their nervous system is in high arousal, they're highly susceptible to triggers, to intrusions, traumatic re-experiencing, it absolutely makes sense that the betrayed partner in that situation is now going to focus on safety. And it also makes sense that a huge part of that is seeking safety from their partner, wanting him to avoid certain things, wanting to make sense of what occurred and wanting to understand, down to the most minute detail in some cases, exactly what occurred, so that they can have a foundation to move forward from. Unfortunately, in a lot of these situations, these understandable safety-seeking behaviours are pathologized. The partner is pathologized, and we essentially end up in a situation where victim blaming is occurring, either intentionally or unintentionally. So somebody who has experienced trauma and is trying to seek safety after that acute impact is instead seen as somebody who, for example, is trying to control the other person. Rather than seeing things like boundaries as something that she needs for her safety, it's seen as, no, she's trying to control him. She's trying to control the addict, to use the codependent terminology that we briefly discussed previously. Or when she's repeatedly asking questions about the basement and what occurred in the basement, you'll hear things like, she needs to stop playing detective. She's just pain shopping. And this really does link back to that sort of codependent thinking where, again, it was seen that the betrayed partner of the sex addict has her own codependence problem, her own pathology she needs to work through. So she really does need to stop trying to control him, stop trying to be the detective, stop trying to manage his recovery, stop pain shopping. But if we step back and remember that critically important point that we're really trying to highlight here with this DST model, we have identified this as a two-part problem that is an abusive system that has disempowered the partner more than just a sexual acting out problem. And we mustn't lose sight of the fact that we are generally talking about ongoing patterns of harm here. It's not like post-discovery everything suddenly changes. So even if, hypothetically, we were only dealing with the abuse and trauma that had occurred prior to and at the point of discovery, we would still be understanding the safety-seeking behaviours and the trauma responses. But in this case, in reality, we're almost certainly talking about ongoing patterns of integrity abuse, where the partner's reality is still being manipulated in various ways. When we see it in that light, a partner's reactions should be even more understandable, and we should be even more concerned about victim blaming and pathologizing those reactions. We should also be very aware of the potential for what we call DAVO, which stands for deny, attack, and reverse victim offender, which is a well-established abuse tactic. The idea being that someone who has perpetrated harm in some way will often deny what they've done, especially when challenged about it, and attack the other person as a way of reversing the victim and the offender. So in this case, especially because the patterns of abuse have often been more subtle, because they're based on deception, manipulation, and covert control, it can be very seductive in a sense when the person is able to portray her as the problem. Look how she's trying to control me. Look how she's treating me. Look how unstable she is. And so it's possible to build a fairly compelling picture of her being the problem, her even being the abusive one, her being the crazy one, and him being the victim if we don't understand this bigger picture. And as clinicians in this field, especially if we do fall into that trap, then not only is there the potential for victim blaming to occur, but there's also the potential for unintentional collusion with ongoing abuse. And that's not something I say lightly. Misinterpreting what happened in the past is bad enough. But if we miss the patterns of harm happening in the present, and worse yet, if we start to see the partner's reactions and her safety-seeking behaviours as the primary issue, we're in danger of causing significant additional harm. We must remember that it's normal for somebody who is in a system of ongoing harm to become preoccupied with those patterns of harm and to try to control them or stop them from happening. And this, of course, is especially apparent when that person is in an ongoing relationship with the person who has caused the harm. It's important that we don't underestimate that part of the story with deceptive sexuality. With many types of trauma, we're talking more about something that happened exclusively in the past that we're trying to deal with in the present. But in this case, we're often talking about past and present harm and the potential for ongoing future harm because the person is potentially trying to continue in and rebuild a relationship with this person. Now, having said all of this, I do want to acknowledge here that ultimately, we want that sense of psychological safety for any person to come from within, to come from a grounded nervous system, from an expanded window of tolerance. But when there are abusive or harmful behaviours present, those things rightfully become the focus for achieving some initial safety. And so it's wrong to expect the betrayed partner to develop an internal sense of safety when there are external threats still present. So again, things like boundaries, disclosures, the need to piece the story together. We can think of them as prerequisites of safety, of being able to move towards that inner sense of safety that we ultimately want in the long term. So some external stability, having the things I need around me in order to help me ground my nervous system, can then give the breathing space to gradually build more of a solid foundation from which healing can start to happen. But until the right conditions are provided, and again, that's especially if I am in an ongoing relationship with the person who has caused me harm, then it's really impossible for me in many ways to start working on my internal safety. So put simply, if my nervous system is constantly being dysregulated, healing and growth really can't occur. And another nuanced but really important point to add to this is that ultimately nobody can heal somebody else's trauma. So he cannot heal her. He cannot take away the trauma that has now occurred. And I think that's a really difficult and challenging thing for us to sit with because it doesn't seem fair in so many ways. But what he can do is learn to provide the conditions where healing is possible for her. An analogy I like to use is to think of the way that a seed grows, how a seed grows into a plant. Nobody makes it grow. Instead, we provide the conditions like adequate sunlight, water, nutrient-rich soil, and then the growth of the seed organically takes care of itself. And in this case, he can provide conditions like safety, like authenticity, like integrity. He can learn to deal with things in the house rather than in the basement. He can learn to sit with her pain. So he can't heal her trauma, but he can absolutely provide conditions where she can start to heal. I'm going to draw this episode to a close now, having covered a difficult topic and one where, unfortunately, we often see a lot of blind spots still, and therefore a lot of additional trauma caused. And this is another reason that highlighting the two-part problem of deceptive sexuality and the patterns of integrity abuse that are occurring becomes crucial. If we miss that, we're at risk of wrongly pathologizing the partner, misunderstanding her safety-seeking behaviours, and potentially colluding with ongoing harm. So we've now spent 2 or 3 episodes looking at the acute trauma from a few different angles. And so in the next episode, I'm going to spend some time discussing complex trauma and why it's so important also when we're talking about deceptive sexuality. Thank you for listening to this episode of the From Harm to Healing podcast. If you'd like to find out more information about the deceptive sexuality trauma model itself, you can visit minwalamodel.com. If you're interested in the services that I offer, in particular the From Harm to Healing treatment program, please visit chrisjonestherapy.co.uk.